In 2014, I discovered this run of 20 volumes, the only known marked set of Dickens's weekly journal all the year round, covering the entire first series from 1859 to 1868. Most of the material that was published in the periodical appeared anonymously, and until my discovery, very little has been known about who wrote what. The short stories, articles and poems that appeared under Dickens's editorship, as no records have previously come to light. My set gives plenty of clues in the marginal annotations, but when all you have to go on in tracing an author are common name tokens like Mr. Jones or Mr. Burgess, there remains plenty of work for a researcher to get his teeth into before being able to positively identify the bearer of that name. I've spent 3 years of full-time research undertaking that very task, digging in the digital archive. Over that time, I've identified countless previously unknown writers and written biographies of roughly 280 of the 322 contributors who wrote for the magazine down to December 1868, including a Mr. Jones, Robert Jones, a coach builder from North Wales, and a Mr. Burgess, Bowie Burgess, a soldier who served in India. Some were easier to pin down than others, like Mr. Spate, the novelist Thomas Wilkinson Spate, or Miss Hopley, the natural history writer Catherine Cooper Hopley, while others, such as the Reverend Joaillier, remained stubbornly opaque for a long time until I cracked the unintentional code of misspelling. Joaillier was actually Chevalier, or else continued to be impenetrable, such as the Indian writer recorded as Raphal Das Halden, of whom I can find no trace in the archives. Any leads on that one would be greatly appreciated. For this talk, I'm going to concentrate on 2 individuals and their intertwined destinies, each of whom published just one piece in the first series of All the Year Round, though they both continued writing for the new series under the editorship of Charles Dickens. One of them was relatively straightforward to identify, whilst the other was much, much harder, though enormously rewarding when I finally made the breakthrough.
Eureka!
Everyone dies in the end, as the figures that I'll be talking about were mid to late Victorians. But in their lives, which I will briefly try to recreate, there were vicissitudes of fortune, success, tragedy, idealism, an improbable coincidence straight out of the pages of Dickens, and as close as one can get to a happy ending. So, please, settle back with a drink of your choice, and perhaps a box of tissues at hand, as this is a story that even has me welling up as I tell it. Complying with the etiquette of ladies first, I'll start by addressing the name token Miss Cleaves that I found next to a very odd short story, ominously entitled Under Sentence of Death, that appeared in All the Year Round on October the 31st, 1868. Clemes was not a name that I knew, and initially I thought it might be a mistranscription for a well-known name such as Clements. However, I soon discovered that it was a real, albeit rare, English surname, but as the census data from 1851 reveals, it was found almost exclusively in Cornwall, the far southwest tip of England. This fact gave me some cause for optimism, as the census returns for 1851 and 1861 each list only about 70 individuals bearing the name Clemes. These I gradually whittled down by excluding all the males, 50%, all the married Mrs. Clemeses, 50% of the remainder, and any unmarried females who would have been under 14 or over 70 in 1868. The census also notes the occupations of the adults in each household, and I excluded any female designated as a farmhand, milkmaid, shepherdess, or, this is true, a pig woman, as almost certainly being illiterate. Once I'd completed this sifting, a grand total of one name remained, a girl named Jane Clemes from St Austell in Cornwall, who was 13 in 1861 and so 20 in 1868 when the story appeared in All the Year Round, and described as a scholar. In other words, she attended school and could therefore read and write. Having apparently found my quarry, I proceeded to look for Jane Clemes elsewhere in the archives. Her birth, circa 1848 for example, and the census returns for 1871 and 1881, but there was no trace of her. This young woman appeared to have been alive in 1861, but neither before nor after that date. Now, her birth might not have been recorded, but what could have happened to her subsequently? I speculated that she might have married and hence changed her name, or else emigrated or died. However, there were no records of any such event involving Jane Clemes in the UK data for the period. Reluctantly, I temporarily suspended my search for this contributor and turned my attention to some of the other unknowns with whom I might have more success. One of these was a figure unequivocally named Howard Barrett in the marginal note next to his June 1868 article, Ague and its Cause. Perusal of the text revealed it to be a self-help medical article, and it seemed to come from the pen of a physician. I soon discovered that one Howard Barrett published a standard paediatrics textbook in 1875, The Management of Infancy and Childhood in Health and Disease, and set about tracing this individual in earnest in the 19th century archives of the Public Record Office, which, fortunately, are now largely searchable online. Howard Barrett was born in Leeds in 1842 as the son of a prominent Methodist preacher. I struggled to find any record of his medical training and eventually discovered that this was because he was effectively apprenticed to a medical practitioner in Cambridgeshire and learnt the trade not in medical school but by picking up tips from a doctor in his surgery and on his rounds making home visits to patients. When he'd gained enough experience and confidence, he set up his own practice in the mid-1860s in the mean streets of London's East End. There he was immediately confronted simultaneously by two huge health challenges, a cholera epidemic and widespread malnutrition and starvation during a strike by dock workers. Barrett was deeply moved by the suffering he witnessed and made it his mission in life to help the poor and the needy. In order to do this effectively, however, he needed a solid professional and financial background. He married in 1868 and became the father of 5 children. By 1871, he had established a private practice in Tavistock Square in the fashionable London district of Bloomsbury, treating wealthy patients. Alongside his private practice, he acted as consultant physician to the Bethlem Mental Asylum, from which the word Bedlam, a synonym for madhouse, is derived. And in 1893 he established St Luke's House, a home for the dying poor, close to Regent's Park. This was an early hospice for the terminally ill, allowing respectable working people, including printers, craftsmen, laundresses, policemen, nurses, engineers and governesses, to die with dignity in pleasant surroundings. The home changed premises several times, but Barrett maintained close links with it until his death in 1921, and the hospice itself finally closed as recently as 1985. Howard Barrett was a pioneer of the hospice movement and was also the first medical professional to offer a steady supply of morphine to dying patients to alleviate the suffering of their final moments. Barrett's All the Year Round article, Ague and its Cause, was the doctor's first published work. In it, Barrett, as the writer, and Dickens, as the editor, used the pages of a popular weekly miscellany to communicate current medical knowledge in layman's terms as a source of practical self-help for its readers. Some 6 months after my first failed attempt, I returned to the challenge of finding Miss Cleaves. By then, I was a more skilled online researcher and managed to negotiate my way through a minefield of misinformation in which my subject, Clemes, was variously mistranscribed as Clems without the second E, or clues, inverting the M to a W. I was also greatly assisted by a lot of newly digitised information which was available on the genealogical website Find My Past. One such cache of data, which I will come on to shortly, literally threw open the doors to finding the Miss Cleaves and documenting her extraordinary life, which I will now relate chronologically and in more detail than has ever been given before about this remarkable woman. So, settle down for story time. Isabella Jane Clemes was born in Liskeard, Cornwall on April the 1st, 1847 to Quaker parents. The Quakers are a small but highly influential sect of nonconformist Christians known for plain speech and dress, and incidentally also known for success in business. Quakers founded both Barclays and Lloyd's banks, the shoe manufacturers Clark's, and all the major chocolate and confectionery companies in 19th century Britain: Cadbury's, Rowntree's, Fry's and Terry's. Isabella's father Samuel was a hat maker and her mother was Jane née Willis. When Isabella was still a toddler, her parents decided to become teachers and moved to Yorkshire to teach in the Quaker school at Ackworth near Leeds. Within a year of arriving, her mother died shortly after giving birth. The baby also died. And her father, aged just 29, followed his wife to the grave a few months later, leaving Isabella an orphan at the age of 3. Her elder brother Samuel remained at school in Ackworth, but Isabella was brought back to Cornwall by Priscilla Brown, a kind Quaker friend in Leeds. Indeed, the official name of the Quakers is the Society of Friends. She was then raised by her paternal grandparents in St Austell. Here we can see Isabella on the left with her brother Sammy next to her. From 1857, Isabella attended the Quaker school at Silcott in Somerset, as confirmed by the school's records. She seems to be missing from the 1861 census, but the next mention of her is in the 1871 census, now living in Leeds as the housekeeper to a retired railway official named Isaac Brown. He was a widower with no children, and his deceased wife was Priscilla, whose kindness had spared Isabella from the workhouse and enabled her to return to her extended family in 1851. When Brown died in 1876, he left Isabella a legacy of £1,500. Although this was not a vast sum of money, it was enough to give her some degree of financial independence for the first time in her life. Now here's a question for you. What do you think she did with this money and this newfound independence? Well, in Leeds, she'd been attending lectures organised by the University Extension Movement on the themes of astronomy, sun worship and women in ancient Greece, given by Edward Carpenter, the charismatic philosopher, poet and early gay rights activist. The pair struck up an acquaintance and Carpenter encouraged Isabella to make the most of her talents and to follow her dream. And so at the age of 30, Isabella Jane Clemes enrolled at the recently established Newnham College for Women at Cambridge in 1878, and 3 years later became just the 4th woman in history to complete the mathematics tripos at the famous university. Although women were not formally allowed to graduate from Cambridge until, can you believe it, 1948. In 1881 she was living in Bromley, Kent, with relatives on her mother's side and working as a teacher of mathematics. She joined and became highly active in the Men and Women's Club in London, the first forum where educated, liberal-minded men and women could meet as equals and discuss social, political and intellectual questions, but above all to discuss sex. By 1890 she was living in Tavistock Square in London and was appointed by the Royal Observatory in Greenwich to head a team of 4 Cambridge-educated female mathematicians in the capacity of a lady computer, her job title, calculating times and distances on the basis of astronomical observations and photographing the stars at night. In 1892, however, something happened to her which, quite remarkably, is preserved in accessible public records and which enabled me to reconstruct her life. Before I reveal this, I'll give you a clue, as it concerns Isabella's destiny crossing that of Howard Barrett. Did it concern their shared nonconformist upbringing? Was it the fact that they both lived in Leeds and had studied in Cambridgeshire? Or did they meet through the Men and Women's Club? Or was it the coincidence that they were both living in Tavistock Square in 1892? Initially, at least, none of these. In modern terminology, we would probably say that Isabella had a nervous breakdown or experienced a psychotic episode. For the late Victorians, she was suffering from acute melancholia accompanied by delusions. At the recommendation of a concerned neighbour, she was admitted on March the 8th, 1892 to the Bethlem Lunatic Asylum, where her case notes on admission were written by none other than Howard Barrett. The first point to note is that among her professional distinctions, Dr. Barrett recorded that Isabella writes for journals, confirming that this is the Miss Cleaves I was looking for. We can only speculate as to when in their conversation it emerged that the greatest coincidence of all linking them was the fact that they each made their first appearance in print in Dickens's weekly magazine All the Year Round in precisely the same year, 1868, almost a quarter of a century earlier. Dickens, one imagines, would have been inwardly smiling or chuckling to himself in the grave. Isabella's case notes reveal that she was found wandering in the street at midday in her night clothes and with her face blackened. When she was accosted by a neighbour, who later escorted her to the hospital, she said that she had been up on the roof eating soot to atone for her sins. The cause of her present distressing condition was put down to too much brain work and too little food, but there is plenty of scope here for critics of many different persuasions to re-evaluate the data. Initially she was distant and uncommunicative, but later volunteered the information that she had given up paid employment to concentrate on a novel that she was writing, which aimed to reconcile the teachings of the Bible with modern science, in particular the findings of paleontology and evolutionary biology. She had exhausted her meagre savings and started hearing voices which were alternately angelic and diabolical. When she was escorted to Bethlem, she thought she was being taken to the resurrection and that she would arise as the new Messiah. Although this seems to be a tragic fate for such a talented woman, I'm glad to say it's not the end of the story. Thanks to adequate food, rest, and the kindness of Howard Barrett and his colleagues, the prognosis for Isabella was declared to be good. And after a month in Bethlem, she was transferred to the hospital's rural facility at Whitley in Kent, now home to the Museum of the Mind. After just 3 months of hospitalization, Isabella was released in June 1892, apparently restored to good physical and mental health. The interlude clearly gave her time to reconsider the course of her life, and once again she made an extraordinary, bold decision. Perhaps you might like to spend a moment or two to guess what she did with this newly regained liberty. Well, as travel records in the online archive prove, in October 1892 she bade farewell forever to England and left unaccompanied on the Doric, an emigrant ship bound for Tasmania. This was not, however, a complete leap in the dark, as there she was reunited with her only surviving close relative, her brother Samuel. He had made his way to Australia in 1886 after serving 10 years in Madagascar as a Quaker missionary. By the time Isabella arrived in Hobart, Samuel was already well established as the headmaster of a thriving co-educational Quaker school, and she was welcomed as the star, Cambridge-educated mathematics teacher. Isabella spent the last 11 years of her life in Tasmania, living with her brother and his family. She never married and died in Hobart on January the 24th, 1903. The school that Sammy established and where Isabella finally found her place is still in operation and is the largest Quaker-run school in the world, welcoming boys and girls of all faiths. In my Netflix mini-series version of this story, Howard Barrett's wife had recently died of tuberculosis, and the doctor-patient relationship between Howard and Isabella matures over time into mutual sympathy, friendship, and even love. They openly discuss religion, science, gender roles, the vocations of teaching and medicine, sanity and madness, and their meeting of minds almost leads to a meeting of bodies, before Isabella receives an unexpected letter from her long-lost brother. After much soul-searching, she determines that her true calling is as an educationalist, and so she sails away to the far end of the earth, leaving Howard Barrett on the London quayside to return alone to Bethlem, and within months of Isabella's departure to found St Luke's Hospice, his most enduring legacy as a medical pioneer. Finally, let's return to the unwitting catalyst of this drama, Charles Dickens, and consider what the impact might have been on these two individuals, the one aged 26, the other just 21 in 1868, of having their work accepted for publication in All the Year Round. Howard Barrett was undoubtedly bolstered by Dickens's implicit endorsement to pursue his humanitarian mission, whilst the orphaned Isabella Jane Clemes may well have viewed Dickens as a father figure. Acceptance by him was an affirmation of her worth and intelligence, and may well have been an important early step on the path that led her to pursue a course of studies at Cambridge a decade later, to then challenge gender roles and stereotypes, and finally to find her place in the world, like half the cast of David Copperfield, in far distant but welcoming Australia.